In 1945, while Europe counted its dead and Asia sifted through rubble, the United States owned half the world's manufacturing capacity. Not metaphorically, literally half. The same war that reduced Berlin to skeletal facades and left Tokyo in ashes had performed the opposite miracle on American soil. No bombs fell on Detroit, no tanks rolled through Pittsburgh, and by the time the guns went silent, the country had accidentally engineered the most dramatic economic transformation in modern history. This wasn't the plan. Nobody sat down in 1939 and drew up blueprints for American dominance. But a series of desperate wartime decisions, each made under immediate pressure, built something no empire had managed through conquest. A self-sustaining economic engine that would dictate global terms for generations. Here's how it happened, and why it's unraveling now. Before Pearl Harbor, the American economy was broken. A decade into the Depression, unemployment still hovered around 15%. Factories sat idle. Young men rode freight trains looking for work that didn't exist. The New Deal had provided relief, but not recovery. Industrial output in 1939 was barely higher than 1929, before the crash. Europe was already at war. America was still trying to remember how to build things people wanted to buy. Then December 7th changed the math overnight. Suddenly, the government needed ships, planes, tanks, ammunition, uniforms, helmets, boots, and rations in quantities nobody had ever produced before. And it needed them immediately. Within weeks, Washington began writing checks that would have been unthinkable 12 months earlier. Defense spending went from $2 billion in 1940 to $90 billion by 1944. That's not adjusted for inflation. That's the actual number, in an economy 1/20th the size of today's. The interesting part isn't how much money got spent. It's where it went and what it built. The government couldn't wait for private companies to retool and ramp up production using their own capital. There wasn't time. So Washington paid for new factories directly, paid for the machinery, paid for worker training, paid for raw materials, then leased everything to corporations like Ford, General Motors, and Boeing on terms so generous they barely qualified as capitalism. The government assumed all the risk. Companies kept the profits. And when demand required even faster expansion, Washington just built more factories and handed over the keys. By 1943, the U.S. was producing more military equipment than all other combatants combined. One aircraft carrier every month, one bomber every 60 minutes, a tank every 7 minutes. Numbers that sound impossible until you realize the country had essentially suspended market economics and replaced them with a command production system where money was no object and failure wasn't negotiable. Here's where it gets strange. All that spending should have triggered runaway inflation. You can't double the money supply in 4 years and expect prices to stay flat. Except they did, mostly, because Washington implemented price controls, wage freezes, and rationing that kept consumer demand artificially suppressed. Americans earned more than ever before, but couldn't spend it on cars or appliances or housing because those industries had been converted to war production. So the money just piled up in bank accounts, waiting. 16 million Americans went into uniform, but the civilian workforce actually expanded. Women entered factories in numbers that made the pre-war economy look like a different civilization. Productivity per worker increased by 25% as new manufacturing techniques got refined under deadline pressure. The country learned very quickly how to make complicated things at scale. And once you learn that, you don't forget. Then the war ended, and everyone expected a return to Depression conditions. They were wrong. Europe and Asia were destroyed, not damaged, destroyed. Germany's industrial base was rubble. Japan's cities were ash. Britain was technically on the winning side, but financially ruined, forced to liquidate its empire just to service American loans. The Soviet Union had lost 27 million people and had its western territories scorched to bare earth. France was politically fractured. China was descending into civil war. 16 million Americans went into uniform. But the civilian workforce actually expanded. Women entered factories in numbers that made the pre-war economy look like a different civilization. Productivity per worker increased by 25% as new manufacturing techniques got refined under deadline pressure. The country learned very quickly how to make complicated things at scale. And once you learn that, you don't forget. Then the war ended, and everyone expected a return to Depression conditions. They were wrong. Europe and Asia were destroyed. Not damaged, destroyed. Germany's industrial base was rubble. Japan's cities were ash. Britain was technically on the winning side, but financially ruined, forced to liquidate its empire just to service American loans. The Soviet Union had lost 27 million people and had its western territories scorched to bare earth. France was politically fractured. China was descending into civil war,
which left exactly one industrial economy capable of producing consumer goods at scale. One banking system with capital to lend. One currency people trusted. One country whose factories were intact, whose workers were trained, whose logistics networks functioned, and whose farmland hadn't been shelled for 6 years straight. The Americans didn't conquer anyone. They didn't need to. They just started selling things to countries that couldn't make those things themselves anymore. But here's what made the situation permanent instead of temporary. While other countries were rebuilding, Washington made a series of decisions that locked in American dominance for decades. First, the Marshall Plan. Officially, it was about humanitarian aid and stopping Soviet expansion. Practically, it was a $13 billion program that rebuilt European industry using American machinery, American blueprints, and American technical expertise. Europeans got functioning economies. Americans got guaranteed export markets and customers dependent on U.S. supply chains. Everyone won, except the arrangement made Europe structurally reliant on American production. Second, Bretton Woods. In 1944, while the war was still raging, Allied nations met in New Hampshire and redesigned the global monetary system. They pegged every currency to the dollar. They pegged the dollar to gold at $35 per ounce, and they made the dollar the only currency you could use to buy oil or settle international debts, which meant every country needed dollar reserves, which meant everyone had to export to America or borrow from American banks. This wasn't a neutral arrangement. It gave Washington the ability to print money that other countries had to accept as payment. It turned the Federal Reserve into the world's central bank, whether other countries wanted that or not. And it meant American trade deficits didn't matter the way they would for any other nation, because dollars spent abroad just came back as investments in U.S. assets. Third, the military umbrella. America kept troops in Europe and Asia permanently, paid for defense so Allied nations could spend on rebuilding. Which sounds generous until you realize it made those countries strategically dependent on American protection. They couldn't pursue foreign policies Washington opposed, couldn't switch to rival economic systems, couldn't even maintain truly independent militaries. The security guarantee came with invisible strings that lasted generations. By 1950, the United States accounted for more than a quarter of global economic output, despite having 6% of the world's population. American companies dominated every major industry. American banks financed every major project. American culture saturated global media. And it all traced back to the wartime decisions that built excess capacity nobody else could match. People talk about the post-war boom like it was inevitable, like prosperity was the natural reward for winning. But Japan and Germany also rebuilt. Britain and France eventually recovered. None of them experienced anything remotely comparable to American growth in the 50s and 60s. The difference wasn't willpower or culture or values. The difference was structural. The global economy had been rewired to flow through American institutions. Oil got priced in dollars. International debt got issued in dollars. Central banks held reserves in dollars, which created permanent demand for U.S. currency regardless of America's actual trade balance. If you wanted to buy Saudi oil or Chinese steel or Brazilian coffee, you needed dollars first. And the only way to get dollars was to export to America or borrow from American banks. This is what economists call exorbitant privilege. The ability to import more than you export indefinitely because your currency is the global reserve. Any other country running persistent trade deficits would see their currency collapse. America just printed more dollars and watched the world absorb them. But here's the part nobody anticipated. The system only works as long as everyone trusts the dollar will hold value. As long as the U.S. maintains technological leadership, as long as American institutions remain stable, as long as other countries don't develop alternative arrangements. Fast forward to now. China's economy is larger than America's by some measures. The EU collectively rivals U.S. output. India's growing faster than anyone. Countries are settling trade in yuan, in euros, even in cryptocurrencies designed specifically to bypass dollar dominance. The petrodollar system is fracturing as Saudi Arabia explores non-dollar oil sales. And America's share of global GDP has fallen from 27% in 1950 to around 24% today. Which sounds like a modest decline, until you realize the entire post-war order was built on unchallenged American supremacy. Every international institution, every trade agreement, every security arrangement assumed the U.S. would remain the indispensable economy. The one buyer everyone needed access to, the one currency everyone needed to hold. That assumption is becoming less true every year, not because America collapsed, because everyone else caught up. The manufacturing base that won the war is mostly gone, moved overseas where labor costs less. The infrastructure built in the 40s and 50s is literally crumbling. The education system that trained the most productive workforce on Earth now ranks middling among developed nations. The political system that made hard choices under pressure now struggles to pass basic budgets. The technological lead that seemed insurmountable is shrinking as other countries invest more in research. Meanwhile, debt has replaced production as the engine of American consumption. The country imports far more than it exports, finances government spending through bond sales to foreign creditors, maintains living standards by borrowing against future growth that may not materialize. None of this is secret. Everyone can see the trajectory. But changing course would require restructuring an entire economy built on assumptions that no longer hold. It would mean telling voters their living standards must decline temporarily so their grandchildren can have functioning infrastructure. It would mean accepting that America can't dictate terms to countries who now have alternatives.
World War II didn't just defeat fascism. It accidentally created a global economic order centered entirely on one country's institutional advantage. That order delivered 70 years of relative peace and unprecedented prosperity. But it was always contingent, always dependent on circumstances that couldn't last forever. The question isn't whether American dominance will end. Historically, every dominant power eventually declines. The question is what comes next. Whether the transition happens smoothly through negotiated reform or catastrophically through crisis and conflict. Because here's the uncomfortable truth hiding in plain sight. The same system that turned America into a superpower is now the main obstacle to adapting to a world where that superpower status is no longer sustainable. Unwinding Bretton Woods means losing exorbitant privilege. Reducing military commitments means losing strategic leverage. Rebuilding manufacturing means accepting lower profits and higher prices. Every path forward requires surrendering advantages that feel permanent, but were only ever temporary. The war ended 80 years ago. The factories are gone. The workers retired. The currency system is fraying. But the assumption of dominance persists, baked into policy and culture and institutional memory. Eventually, assumptions meet reality. The only question is whether you see it coming.
If this video helped you understand how World War II quietly turned the US into an economic superpower, subscribe for more clear breakdowns of money and global power. Like to support the channel, comment what surprised you most, and share it with someone who should know how this system was built.